I have some how-to tips on storytelling, which is there are only a few things you really need to know to get started. Everyone knows how to tell a story. You just need a little bit of direction to make it presentable. So, the first thing I have down here is find a story you really like. You need to feel the story belongs to you. Those are the ones you can most easily tell. Daniel Morden, who's a wonderful storyteller, tells a lot of fairy tales, said, telling a story you don't like is the same thing as telling a joke you don't get. It's not going to work. You have to resonate with the story. The story, as I say, it has to belong to you. You have to read it enough. And you don't always know when it belongs to you. Often you read a story, oh, that's a great story, and you try and tell it, but it's not quite your story. That happens a lot. It's one of the things I love about our story circles. I can take a story, work it up, try it out, and see if it resonates with me, see if it resonates with the audience. And there are other stories you think, it's an okay story, and then you find it's a lot of fun to tell, and becomes one of your signature stories. So you have to work with the stories. So it's just more than just liking them, it's really having them become part of you. You live with these stories. I like to also put it that way. You live with the stories you really like. There are stories in my repertoire I've been telling for 15 years. And I'll tell them again. I just love them. And then there's new stories that just enter in and just become part of your repertoire. And there are stories that fall out of your repertoire as you change as a teller. So it's a relationship that you have between yourself and the story. Imagine the story in your mind. Create the characters and the setting. See that dragon in your imagination. Create your own little movie in your head. The more you can imagine the story, the less you have to memorize. This is more than a suggestion. This is crucial for storytelling, in my mind. If you don't see the story, then your audience isn't going to see the story. It's all about the imagination, imagining the story. When I tell a story, I am seeing, in the back of my head, I am seeing the story. If that doesn't happen to me, I can't expect it to happen to my audience. My audience also sees the story if I'm seeing it. If I'm seeing the words of the story, my audience is going to see the words of the story. And that's not what the story is about. The story is about the images. There once was an old fisherman and his wife, Isabel, who lived in a run-down, miserable hovel by the sea. The sort of place that when it rained, the water came in and sat around on the chairs. Every day he went fishing. And if he caught something, that was their supper. If not, well, there was always cabbages. What did the fisherman look like? What did your fisherman look like?
I picture him with rain gear.
Pardon?
A middle-aged man with rain gear, with a fishing pole, just standing by the beach.
Bruce.
Salt and pepper mustache with a very, very weather-beaten face and an oilskin overcoat.
Billy Crystal in the Never-Ending Story.
Perfect. I said not one word about what he looks like. I said he was a fisherman. You were creating that fisherman. That is the creative process, or what we call the co-creative process. That is crucial to storytelling. And it really has a lot to do with somebody standing in front of you telling you that story. There's something about that relationship that the mind just starts to create. But I need to see my somewhat rotund fisherman with a scruffy beard, a seaman's cap, missing a few teeth. That's my fisherman. Yeah, but I need to see him. For you to see your particular fisherman, that is that process. And that, for me, that is central to storytelling. Don't memorize the whole story. As long as you know what happens in the story, find your own words to describe the action. Again, if you memorize the words, if you're trying to memorize a story word for word, it is going to fall flat. You need to see the story and find your own words to tell that story. When you get to folk tales, fairy tales, it is your artistic choice what words you use to tell those stories. I like to keep the vocabulary within the realm of that story, which means I got to know what that story is about, where it comes from, what the tenor of it is. A little example, I do a Mark Twain show. And one of the first things, he used to say, well, I'm so happy to be here. I realized, no, that's just wrong. So happy to be here. I mean, no. Now it's, good evening, I'm so gratified to be here. It's an older word. This is a Victorian word. Twain is a Victorian man. That's what he would say. So you need to find the words, that one that you're comfortable with, in a cadence that's comfortable for you. Because sometimes the fairy tales are very kind of archaic language, and you'll stumble on it if you try and do it word for word. Although sometimes you find in the passage certain words that just work. In Childe Roland, there's the word Widershine. Bird Ellen passes Widershine around the church. That is, she passed opposite the sun. That's a wonderful word. You just can't leave that word out of that story. But these are artistic choices. And that's part of you as a storyteller. So don't memorize the story. I do go on to say, though, here that you can memorize the very beginning of the story, word for word, and the very end of the story, word for word. That's fine, because that's a guidepost. You know where to start, and you know where you're going to end. You may also want to remember 3 events along the way, again, as guideposts, so you don't lose the context of where the story is going. You only need the outline in your mind. But again, as long as you're seeing the story, you're just describing what you're seeing. As long as you know what the train of action is going to be. One of our storytellers, Larry Skierman, calls it walking through Larryland. I know Debbie Thomaston, the Native American teller, she describes that same process. And what happens with her is she's walking through the story and she sees something that she hadn't seen in the story before, and she tells it. After a couple years, this 10-minute story is now 20 minutes long, and she has to strip it all the way back down to where it began, and then she lets it grow out again. Always finding new stuff to put into the story. That's her process. Slow down. Don't rush a story. Give your listeners time to imagine the story. Give them time to create their own little movie in their heads. You can speak far slower than you think you can. And people will still listen, just like you are now. If you rush a story, there are some people that just and you need to give your listeners time to create the images in the story. So you can go at a very casual pace, and everyone will be quite comfortable with you. Speak up and speak clearly. Edit out and then, like, you know, so, and unless it's really necessary. If you're telling a story, there once was a king and a queen, and they had a lovely daughter, and one day she was walking in the woods, and a prince came up to her, and he said, "It's no good. People will not create the image until they hear the period." There was a king and a queen. They had a beautiful daughter. One day she was walking in the woods, and a prince came up to her. "Ah, my dear," he said, etc. You need the period to create that image, the king and the queen, the daughter, the woods, the prince approaching her. Get those ands and ahs and so's, likes, you knows out of there. They don't forward the story. They're very distracting. Slow down and remember not to say them, and you'll be fine. But so often I hear, even storytellers have been around for a while, throw in the ands and the ahs and the you knows. It doesn't work. It's, in a way, the listener edits those things out, but still, it can take them out of the story. They're not concentrating on the story, they're editing what you're saying. Eye contact is important. If you don't see them, they can't hear you. That may not be logical, but I've been to, enough poetry readings. The poet is reading their poem and going on and on like this. They never look at the audience. The audience is just fading out. You need to say the sentence, look back into your paper, look out again. If you're doing a reading for the storyteller, you don't tell a story like this. They're not going to listen to you very long. You need to look at your audience. I'm always kind of scanning my audience as I'm telling a story. Eye contact is very important. Storytelling is one of the, let's say, theatrical art forms without the fourth wall. In theater, the actors are on stage, they're addressing each other, the audience is behind that glass wall. And unless the actor comes to the edge of the stage and does a monologue with the audience, there's a fourth wall. Storytelling, no fourth wall. You're always interacting with your audience. For a lot of tellers, as their audience reacts to them, they will actually change the story they're telling. They'll feed into the emotion in the room. I tend not to do that with fairy tales, which I often tell because they're a little more formulated. But it's not unusual for storytellers to engage their audience and react with them. Put your hands in your pocket or behind your back. Hide them unless you're going to use them. Don't let them wander around scratching your head. That's another common fault. People will tell their story, they'll wander around the stage. I mean, some people actually, and after about 10 minutes of that, the audience is going to get very dizzy. Best thing to do is tell your story like this. There's a Canadian storyteller. I think his last name is Barton. This is how he tells. He never moves. Every story he tells is here. Then there's Ethnotech, who actually dance. Two people dancing while they tell. But that's choreographed. There's a purpose for the movement. If you don't have a purpose to move, stand still. Best thing you do. I tend to use gestures in almost a pantomime sense. There was a fisherman and his wife, Isabel, who lived in a miserable hovel by the sea. When it rained, the water came in to visit and sat around on the seats. That was my movement. Think of yourself as being in a box. You never move out of the box or gesture out of the box. Because if you say, look, your whole audience, they're going to look. They're going to lose contact with you and be out of the story for that moment. So I'm in the box. The hero will say, look, I haven't left the box. My audience hasn't been deflected. So movement is generally less is more, unless you have a purpose. If the story slops, which our teller Ingrid Bone does, the old man lifts the slops bucket and he takes it out to the door. If you have a reason to move, then it's fine. But don't wander around the stage telling your story like this, waving your hands. Your audience is going to get dizzy. That is your own nervousness coming out, and you'll make your audience nervous. Last little point is props. Try to avoid using props. Especially for a beginning storyteller, they can be dangerous. Unless you're Willie Claflin and Maynard the Moose. He's well known among the storytellers. He's terrific. But generally, props find their way to the floor at inconvenient times. And they tend to be distracting more than useful. So as a beginning storyteller, try not to use them. When I do my Twain show, I have a cigar, I'm in a white suit, and I have a chair. That's it. I put the cigar away pretty early in the program. There's one point where I take off my jacket. That's as much props as I need. The hardest show I ever did was an Albert Einstein show, a science show, a summer reading program. The theme was science. So I was doing small scientific experiments on stage using static electricity. And static electricity is not dependable. I will tell you that right now. There are days when it doesn't work. That was the worst show because I just had a myriad of props. And I knew I was getting myself into trouble, but that particular show called for it. With Einstein and science, I had to do it. And after summer was over, I said, I'm not doing that again. Just carrying that paraphernalia around is a problem. So I love doing the fairy tales. I show up like this, and I tell. And that, to me, is pure storytelling, and where it's at its best. All right. Any questions before I go on about this? So just a really quick review. You want to find the stories you really like, because those are the only stories you can tell. You need to imagine the story. You need to see the story for your audience to see the story and create those images. I suggest you memorize the beginning and the end, just as bookends, so you know where you start, you know where you're going to end. You know, a couple little events, remember a couple little events along the way, which are kind of high points that you're heading towards in the story. And when you get to that point in the story, head for the next one. keep yourself on track. Don't memorize the words. The words will fail you. You'll get halfway through and all of a sudden you can't remember that next word and you stop. The whole story stops just because you can't remember one damn word. So know the story. See the story. As long as you see the story, you just describe what you're seeing as the story goes on. Slow down. Give the time for people to see the images that they're creating. Speak up, edit out the ands, uhs, likes, you knows. They're not part of the story. They're connecting sentences. You need to hear the period. The listener needs to hear the period so they know when to create the image that you've just presented to them. Eye contact. Again, if you can't see them, they can't hear you. And put your hands in your pockets if you're not going to use them. Don't let them wander around and wave in the air uselessly. And try to avoid props.
Well, I know it needs to be slow because I'm getting deaf, and so when it is slower, that really makes me process things better. Also.
Yeah, you have people who, a lot of gray hairs are attracted to storytelling, and yeah, you got to slow down a bit. Just even for kids, they need that time to process. But yeah, we gray hairs, we like to sit back, relax, and know we're hearing all of the story. So the clearer it is, the better for everyone.